All right, I guess let's kick it off. So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike Balsamo. I'm a board member here at the National Press Club and lead Justice Department and law enforcement reporter for the Associated Press. We're so happy to have with us Geoffrey Cain, a foreign correspondent and scholar of East and Central Asia. Jeff is a former correspondent at The Economist and a regular commentator in outlets including the Wall Street Journal, Time, and Foreign Policy. His award-winning first book, Samsung Rising, was named a Cult of Mac Best Tech Book of 2020, and his latest book, The Perfect Police State, an Undercover Odyssey into China's terrifying surveillance dystopia of the future, is now out. In that book, Jeff investigates how the Chinese province of Xinjiang becomes the site of a nightmare Orwellian social experiment. So, Jeff, welcome to the National Press Club.
Thank you, Mike, for having me. I'm very happy to be here. Really happy to have this conversation today.
So folks who are on the Zoom with us, you're welcome to submit questions for Jeff during this program. If you'd like to ask a question, you can jump in the Zoom Q&A feature there and just post that, and we will be sure to get to your question. So Jeff, let's kind of kick it off broadly. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what your book is about and what led you to write it?
Sure. So thank you, Mike. So I started writing this book back in 2017. I had been a reporter based in Asia and the Middle East for many years, and I had developed a beat around technology and the intersection of technology with government, with politics and democracy and authoritarianism. There was a time about 8 to 10 years ago, back when I was starting out as a correspondent, when people were saying that Silicon Valley was going to save the world and we should lean in and accept social media and technology. But very early on, there was a large group of foreign correspondents, and I was among them, we were covering these technologies, and globally outside of America, we actually saw early on that the opposite was happening. That actually some of these these authoritarian governments such as China, Russia, Turkey, elsewhere, were starting to deploy these same technologies that were being developed in America for nefarious, for bad faith purposes, for repressing their populations. And so, I had been in North Korea. I had been covering authoritarian regimes, Myanmar, covered a genocide for a while, Vietnam, Turkey, Russia, the Trans-Siberian Railway. I had spent all these years among these regimes, and I thought I had seen it all when it came to human rights abuses and some of the terrible things that happen around the world. But I had been visiting the region of Xinjiang in Western China over the years, and I saw this very eerie, dark, rapid deterioration in just the situation there. I visited, my most recent trip was in December 2017. And I left the airplane and I exited, took a taxi into this, like, it had suddenly become, this region had become this Orwellian nightmare, this dystopian sci-fi film, like something out of, an old Minority Report with Tom Cruise, or, the movie Brazil, that sci-fi film, or Blade Runner or something. It was truly a terrifying experience because I realized that, that I, and also, people who I was kind of interacting with, we were all being watched 24/7 by a pretty novel artificial intelligence system that was set up by the Chinese government. It was called the IJOP, and the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. And it was a system that would gather mass data on everyone, and would essentially decide who is going to commit a crime in the future, a pre-crime, and would send in the police and would sweep up these suspected future terrorists and put them in a network of concentration camps where the Uyghur people of this region, a Muslim group, would be indoctrinated, brainwashed, psychologically tortured, forced to deny their reality, who they are, their history, their heritage, their language, and to simply have this identity wipe, and then to become, good citizens and good patriots of the Chinese nation. So I decided I needed to write this book because it was, it was just something that, it just blew away anything that I had seen before. And I knew, on my most recent visit, that this was going to become a major topic in the coming years, a major lesson, not just for what's happening in China, not just for the Uyghur people of China, but for the just for humanity, for how we adopt new technologies and how we govern them and manage them, how we ensure that they're in the right hands and they don't get out of control. This is the worst case scenario. This is the the sci-fi dystopia that the old authors like George Orwell feared, and this is the what I would consider this to be the nonfiction incarnation of what those authors had been writing 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can dive a little kind of deeper on that. So can you give us a sense of, what the daily life of a Uyghur is in Xinjiang, and how China is using some of this technology, facial recognition, cameras, DNA collection, AI, and basically everything under the sun there, to surveil, every move of these people?
Yeah. So the daily life of a Uyghur person in Xinjiang is one of 24/7 monitoring and surveillance by the state, by the police. So just to give you an idea, this is a hypothetical that's based on dozens of interviews with Uyghurs who've escaped. But let's say you wake up in the morning. If you're a woman, you might actually wake up next to a man who was sent there by the Communist Party to teach your family the Communist Party values, the loyalty to the state, making sure that you're a good patriot. You might wake up to someone who's actually, like a government minder in your bed who was sent to replace, say, your husband or your partner who had been taken away to a concentration camp. And you might, you'll wake up. There will often be a camera in your living room. You can eat breakfast with your children. This minder will ask you questions and teach you lessons and just ensure that your thinking is in line, that you're not committing some kind of thought crime against the state. You might go to work for the day. You can stop at the market. When you go into the market, there will be government cameras watching everyone, watching what they purchase. So if you purchase something like diapers for your babies, the AI system might raise your trustworthiness ranking. It says that you're more trustworthy because that means you're a good parent. But if you go to a section like the alcohol section and you're buying, whiskey or whatever beer, your social trust ranking might go down. You might be considered untrustworthy because it means you have some kind of problem or you're just not, something's wrong with you. You'll leave, and let's say you go to the gas station. There will be people scanning their IDs to get gas. They scan their government IDs. There will be guards surrounding them, watching them as they scan their IDs. And if somebody's ID pops up and says untrustworthy, that's your ranking based on everything you've done, you could be denied gas. You're not allowed to go to the gas station anymore and get gas there. And the police might come in and just detain you and send you to a concentration camp if your ranking falls that low, because it means that you might commit a crime in the future. You could go to work, you'll sing the national anthem with your colleagues. You'll be shown patriotic movies and documentaries. It'll tell you how to spot a terrorist. Please report a terrorist to the authorities if you think there's a terrorist. That means that everyone is watching you and you're watching everyone. Everyone is snitching on each other, spying on each other. The government will tell you crazy things like a terrorist is someone who, say, buys a tent and camping equipment and wants to go camping very suddenly and hasn't shown this kind of activity before. If they do that, that might be a sign of terrorism. So I could go on and on, the average day, but you'll go home, your kids tell you about lessons for the day. What they learned at school. It's all patriotic propaganda. And, if you question it or challenge it, your kids might report you to the teacher and, the police will show up at your door and take you to a camp for indoctrination. You'll go to sleep. There's this strange government minder in your bed, potentially. He can do whatever he wants there. Like the government doesn't endorse sexual assault. It says it doesn't. But like if you resist some kind of advance, you could, this person could make up some kind of allegation against you and you'll be sent to a concentration camp. So this is just a day in the life of a Uyghur person in Xinjiang. And this is truly, this is why I wanted to tell the world and write this book, because just the intense suffering and surveillance that exists in this region. I think it's beyond what we've seen before in terms of the history of these regimes. There have been terrible regimes and genocides in the past. There's been Pol Pot's Cambodia, Soviet Union, Mao's China, the Cultural Revolution. But in terms of just the intensity of the data gathering and the watching and the use of facial recognition and cameras and artificial intelligence, this is just something on another level that we haven't really seen before.
Yeah, I think, for so many Americans, this is so far out of the norm, right? This is so far in the extreme that it's hard for some of us to wrap our heads around exactly what's happening there. Maybe we could talk a little bit about how it's gotten to this point, right? How it's reached this extreme surveillance state, to the point where government minders, you could wake up and there's a government minder sleeping in your bed.
Yeah. So and that's the when I was writing the book, when I was researching and reporting these facts, even I was just blown away. It felt like going down the rabbit hole, and just the situation was getting worse and worse and more bizarre. And it's like, I would be in the middle of writing the book, and someone would call me and tell me something new that happened, their family member in the region, and I'm just thinking, like, seriously, like, I thought this is the worst it can get, and now they're sending minors into people's beds to sleep with them. So this region of Xinjiang, just to give some backdrop, ever since the Chinese Communist Party seized power in 1949, this region has always been suspect. Historically it was always it was politically independent. It had its own culture, language, and history that was separate from the Han Chinese, the East Coast. So it was very much a frontier, and you could think of it in a similar way to the expansion of America across the West, the manifest destiny, the displacement of Native Americans from their historical homeland. It does have a similar kind of parallel feel to it, but that was in the 19th century, whereas this is happening with all these new technologies that exist. And so what happened over the years, so the Cold War ended, a lot of people here were agitating for independence in this region. They wanted their own state, which would be called East Turkestan. But then 9/11 happened, and when the U.S. launched its war on terror, it had detained a number of Uyghurs in Guantanamo Bay, 22 of them to be precise. And China seized on this war on terror moment because it was concerned, about certain, there was a small number of terrorists and independence fighters among the Uyghur population, but they seized on it as an excuse to launch a widespread dragnet of oppression, just to get rid of the problem and put people in jail. Don't question us, don't question the government. And so in 2009, protests broke out. This was after the Beijing Olympics, China's big coming out moment. And protests broke out because a lot of Uyghurs and other minority groups felt that they were not being they were not sharing in China's new wealth, that they were being left behind from the story of this nation rising. And then in the ensuing years, a number of terrorist attacks happened in China, allegedly by Uyghur perpetrators. There was an attack on Tiananmen Square, which is sort of like attacking Times Square in America. A car bomb went off. There was an attack on a train station in a place called Kunming. It was a knife attack, and a few people died in that attack. And so when these terrorist attacks struck, China used it as yet another reason to elevate its level of repression to something that it had not really done before. I mean, the Chinese government has always been authoritarian. It was always repressive, but just the level of brutality. This was, in the years 2013 to about 2016, it started getting out of control. And then as this brutality was growing, the Chinese government and numerous global and Chinese companies were innovating new ways of using neural nets and deep learning and artificial intelligence, various technologies to just gather mass data on everyone. They would gather, their text messages, their app messages, their camera data, and it was the Chinese government that had this idea to fuse these new technological governments with the old school, extreme, the over policing and the brutality. And once this happened, the system started getting out of control. and just the ball started rolling, and now we have this situation in Xinjiang where 1/10 of the population, about 1.8 million people, is in a concentration camp. This is the largest internment of ethnic minorities since the Holocaust. That's how serious this is. It's not, gas chambers and mass graves, but it is just a massive internment of people who are being psychologically wiped and tortured, based on their ethnicity, based on their religion, which is Islam, and it really is. It's more of a slow burn. It's kind of a slow burn genocide, the slow burn erasure of a people, starting from a war on terror situation.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly a huge civil rights crisis that warrants, as much coverage as possible here. But maybe we could talk a little bit about, obviously you've reported in authoritarian countries, North Korea, Myanmar, Russia, Turkey. But your book draws heavily on interviews with Uyghurs, with refugees and camp survivors. And in the forward of your book, you write about the challenges of relying on, testimony from refugees. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the steps you took to protect the identities of those people while remaining kind of true to their stories.
Yes. Um, so, I went in with a, knowing that, many of these people I was interviewing, their families are still in Xinjiang. They're potentially in danger. And so my rule was that I would grant, anonymous, names, pseudonyms to people who had a legitimate threat of their security, their physical security overseas, which is an issue, or their family back in the region. Anyone who already had a public name out there. There were a number of Uyghurs who've been campaigning, who, we all know who they are. They were not anonymous. They could interview with me, but if they requested an anonymous pseudonym of some kind, I did not grant that because they had already told their stories publicly. So, as a reporter, I don't enjoy using anonymous sources because, as we all know, this is journalism, investigative journalism 101. Anonymous sources are at risk of, inflating the story or fudging things because they can easily hide behind, an anonymous name of some kind. They're not the blame is not going to go back to them if their story turns out to be wrong or fabricated in some way. And, governments can use anonymous sourcing to manipulate stories and kind of make it look like someone who, it's not someone who it really is telling you these stories. So I decided that the way around the anonymous sourcing, so there is a tradition in authoritarian regimes of using anonymous sources because there's simply no other way to tell the story without people being under threat. So I had to weigh those, those challenges, those problematic areas. And I decided in the end that what I was going to do is, I would use two main anonymous sources. One of them was a main character, you could say, a protagonist named Mason, who kind of, her story strings together this entire narrative about how China got to this point. She was a bright young woman who had dreams of becoming a diplomat, which would have been historic in China because she's from the Uyghur ethnic group, graduated near the top of her class, was studying in Turkey for a master's degree, and was called to a camp one day and, got trapped in this Orwellian police state bureaucracy that just was so out of control and so bizarre, and managed to escape through a mixture of brilliance, intelligence, and just a miracle that she could get out. And the other main anonymous source was a defected Chinese spy who, when I interviewed him, he was preparing to defect, and he had leaked a trove of Chinese intelligence documents to me, and leaked the names of numerous spies. And so in the end, so it's actually, he started out anonymous, and then he decided that he wanted to go public on other news outlets. He went on Al Jazeera, he was going to go on BBC. And this, so we agreed that he would not be anonymous just because, he had already been building such a big public profile. So these are the types of areas that, I think as a reporter you have to deal with. So my solution, so I decided to balance the story of Mason, the anonymous woman, balance her off with the stories of these other Uyghurs who were not anonymous and who had the public profiles, and that would allow the reader to kind of cross-check and see that many other people were saying the same thing, that these were well-documented camps, these are well-documented stories, and it's not like she's this one young woman is just showing up and telling her story, and then the entire book is built on one woman's story of escape. And then the other thing I did just to ensure that the information was reliable, first of all, worked with a fact checker, talented young journalist in Taiwan who's a native Mandarin speaker who went through documents, also went through like New York Times reports and looked at the original Chinese sources that that newspapers like the New York Times were using, and just made sure that even they were correctly citing them and correctly translating them. We actually found a number of errors in some of the major newspapers, translation errors and things like that. So we had to correct those in the book. I hope that the book serves as some kind of corrective to what's been put out in some of the press in the past. But that's what happens. And then the last thing I did, just to to cross check, is I relied heavily on Chinese language government tenders and calls for suppliers. So there's a huge network of websites in China that that call for companies to supply the concentration camps. They don't use that word concentration camp, by the way, but they have their own euphemisms. And it's like they would say, we need this much steel, we need this much space, we need this guard tower, we need these many cells. And when you look at those those official government documents, a very clear picture emerges what the government has been trying to do, and I could verify with 100% certainty the location of Mason's camp, where she was, like where she was in the camp, found it on satellite imagery. She went through the testimony with her, everything lined up. I mean, she drew a picture and it matched the satellite imagery. So there's no doubt at all that that what's happening in Xinjiang, it's well documented, it's true, it is a fact. There have been some people trying to claim that this is a hoax or it's exaggerated, but we know for certain now that this is an atrocity that is well documented.
Yeah, and for just a reminder for folks who are on here, you can send questions using the Zoom Q&A feature, and we'll take one of those right now, actually. So maybe, Jeff, you could talk a little bit about the psychological impact of being kind of under this constant surveillance, and then after you talk about that, I have some questions about kind of what you faced while you were there.
Yes, so the psychological aspect is a huge part of the book, and this is why I wanted to rely heavily on my own interviews, because that's really the best way to to sit down with someone. I spent just hundreds of, I mean, with some Uyghurs I spent 40 plus hours interviewing them. I think in total probably thousands of hours of interviews with Uyghurs who had escaped the camps. And the reason I did this was because I wanted to marinate my mind in kind of the psychological effects and some of the psychological torment that they're having. I wanted to try to get as close as I could. Obviously, I can't, get into a concentration camp, but this is the closest you can get psychologically to trying to grasp, what your sources have felt, not just what they've seen and witnessed, but what they've felt. Kind of what rests inside them, what some of the demons are that stick with them even after they leave the camps, and the consistent psychological effect that I found was the denial of one's reality around them. That even after they had escaped the camps, they had run into a situation in which the Chinese authorities had managed to sort of imprison their minds to put them in this state of total denial of what's happening around them, of a fear of authority, of a fear of what's going to happen to their families back in Xinjiang. And in the process, it leads to this kind of this shutdown, this shutdown of, don't think, like thinking is risky, because if you think, someone's going to figure out somehow you might say something, don't think critically, don't question, don't ask questions. Just if you see a police officer, smile, walk by quickly, and like don't say anything out there, like don't say anything out loud, don't go out on the internet and post on social media. It really is a shutdown And this, I think that whoever designed the system was deep in psychology and maybe had studied, some of these major psychological, studies that had happened over the years about kind of how to control people, how to get them, underneath your thumb. So the going back a little bit, like the process of getting them to this psychological state, getting them in the camps, is really one of it's breaking down their identity and their assumptions by giving them a series of riddles. So it's not the riddle is like, where do you draw the line between what is acceptable and what is not acceptable? And to the Uyghurs in the camps, the line is never clear. They're never sure if they're doing something right or something wrong. They have to stop and question themselves, constantly, like, is this going to get me in trouble? Is it not going to get me in trouble? And the way they accomplish that is through these psychological mind games. So just to give you one example, they would give the Uyghur camp inmates a test. They would call them into a room, and one test was there's like a model house on a desk, on one desk, and then there's a desk next to that one, and it has little miniature models of like an AK-47 and a grenade and a rocket launcher. And the police examiners would tell them like that your exam is to like first take this model house and model this miniature yard and rearrange it so it looks like a proper home. And then the inmates would rearrange it and make it look like what a home would look like, with the car in the right place, the street is outside. And then they would say, all right, now we want you to rearrange the AK-47 and the grenade to, what would be the natural arrangement? Like, how would these look if they were on a desk somewhere? And it's like, well, what's the answer to that? I mean, no, like, how could you let, like, an AK-47 has a natural, state on a desk? And so it turned out that the correct answer was to simply not touch the gun and the grenade. If you even touched it and tried to move it around on this desk, then the authorities would declare that you're comfortable around weapons, that you know how to operate them, and therefore you're harboring these terrorist viruses in your mind. They call them viruses, and you need to be cleansed. You need to be, they call it cleansing. They use this kind of language. You need to be cured of your virus. And so they would take you to solitary confinement. They would torture you for many days. They would take you back out, and then they give you the test again, and they'd keep doing this process over and over until finally, either you just figure out, don't touch it, or you just, keep getting tortured, psychologically tortured, until you just break down and, you just can't even take the test anymore. That's how it works. And that's how you deny, that's why they walk around. The Uyghurs often in these camps, they have this feeling of like this amnesia, like they woke up from a car crash and they don't really remember who they are. They don't really have a sense of identity. And that's how, that's achieved. It's through that overwhelming psychological like gaslighting and torture that makes them deny the reality around them.
No, that's absolutely incredible. Maybe we could talk a little bit about kind of the reporting process that you went through. So you talk a little bit about in the book your kind of own brush with China's surveillance state that forced you to, call off a planned trip to Xinjiang. And maybe you can just walk us through here some of the obstacles that foreign journalists like you faced trying to access provinces in China. And for those who do reach there, what the reporting experience is like kind of on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, China, like as a reporter in China, you're really coming into contact with a black box. One of the biggest challenges in China or any regime like this is the access, because the reality, is that just nobody in the Communist Party bureaucracy or the government is going to sit down and, give you an interview just in their right mind. Really you have to rely on victim testimonies if you want to get as close as you can to the story. So I had some early run-ins with the Chinese surveillance state. I didn't realize early on how far its reach had become. So as I started reporting this book, I had bought a ticket to Xinjiang. I was actually in Thailand at the time, getting ready to fly out when the government of Cambodia, which is next door to Thailand in Southeast Asia, had suddenly and just unexpectedly posted all these social media posts, had published all these articles in the news, had broadcast like broadcast this stuff on primetime TV in Cambodia, like showing my photo and declaring that I was a spy for an unnamed superpower country and that I had arrived. I had arrived in Cambodia and I was plotting to overthrow the government as the CIA agent. And it sounded totally ludicrous. Obviously, like, okay, I'm like this one man, spy power, like who's gonna, topple a government, whatever. But the weird part about it, this really sent chills down my spine, was that somehow these Cambodian operatives had obtained information that I was headed to Xinjiang. I had not left yet, but I had only bought a ticket. I didn't post it on social media. I had never, I didn't go around talking about it. It was kind of a low-key project. But somehow, this government had figured out, and they used that as evidence that, like, oh, well, he's going to Xinjiang, so this guy's going to be, stirring up arming the Uyghurs, and he's like the CIA agent who's going to try to overthrow the Chinese government too. And they accused me. I mean, they had found all these other places I had been to, like South Korea, where the president was impeached recently, and they accused me of like instigating the protests there that led to the the impeachment of the president. So I mean, truly bizarre. And like, I mean, looking back on it, I mean, it was scary, but it's almost like, I mean, like how did I mean, I don't even know how to put it into words. Like, how do these guys, figure out some of this stuff? And clearly there is a Chinese surveillance state out there that keeps an eye on people. This is why I've set up a sophisticated cybersecurity system with the help of actual consultants who know how to deal with these regimes. And I recommend any staff reporter or freelancer out there, even if you're working on something that doesn't seem sensitive, get that cybersecurity in order, because we live in a brave new world now where anybody can surprisingly easily reach into your data and reach into your systems, and pull out what they want. I mean, Gmail. Like, I don't know how secure it is behind the scenes. I use Proton Mail often to encrypt and protect my emails, but just there are simple steps that you can take that drastically, just raise your ability to protect yourself and also to protect your sources who are depending on you to be protected.
Yeah, I think that's something that newsrooms across the world are struggling with right now. With that, news organizations kind of for the first time are putting to the forefront not only state-sponsored online harassment, but also the kind of smaller localized harassment in the U.S. of journalists. Maybe you could just talk very briefly a little bit more about some of the tools that you use to protect yourself, to kind of harden that layer of cybersecurity. And if you have advice for folks who are kind of facing that same thing, whether it be, a kind of coordinated harassment campaign or something a little bit less.
Yeah. So the tools that anyone can use are surprisingly easy to get and simple. I mean, in my case, I was just being extra cautious because I'm working on Xinjiang related issues. So I went the extra step and just spoke with like just extreme experts in this topic who know everything about everything. But I mean, for any journalist, I would absolutely recommend getting a security key. So you can order this on Google if you're using Gmail, or you can order it from Amazon or anywhere. But you can get an encrypted. I actually don't have it with me right now. I'm actually not at my usual apartment, but it's a little device about this size that you can plug into your computer, and it will, instead of using your normal password, it'll decrypt your login, and it'll allow you to log in. So literally, the only way you can set up your email, so the only way anyone can log in is if they have this physical device plugged into their computer. I think that one of the key lessons I've learned is that it's important to keep sensitive data off the cloud and off any kind of digital device. A lot of my data, a lot of my interview recordings for this project, I don't even store them anywhere on a computer. I just if there's an email attachment that someone sends me and I need it, I open the attachment and then put it on a USB. I have a super secure USB that has a digital, like a number pad that has a code you can put in to access it. And sensitive files are only on that USB, and there's only one, and that USB does not exist anywhere else. None of those files exist online. So it's a little risky because, what if you lose the USB, then all your data is gone. But that's a risk that, if you're working in the space of, human rights atrocities, you have to be willing to take that risk and just, maybe put that USB in a safe somewhere in your home, just a safe place where it's not going to get lost. So yeah, I mean, that's just lesson two, like keep stuff off the cloud, like don't over rely on the internet, don't over rely on your email. And then the other simple step that anyone can take is just, get a VPN. So ExpressVPN is excellent. It gets excellent reviews. I use that one often. Um, VPNs provide a layer of protection against people snooping, on your web traffic. What else? I'm trying to think if there's anything else. So, use I would use Proton Mail. You can get an encryption code. All these. So Proton Mail is free. It's a free service based in Switzerland, and that's a good example of one that will add a layer of encryption. So it's not like Gmail where you can get hacked. I don't recommend using Facebook messages or Twitter messages. Use what's it called? Telegram, these secure apps. These are the simple steps you can take, but ultimately keep stuff off the internet if you want it to be safe.
Yeah, no, those are really good kind of easy tips, I think, for journalists to use, reporting both in hostile environments and in the US too. But Jeff, we were talking a little bit before we kind of kicked off the webinar about the surveillance state in China and kind of how that translates to the US. So a lot of the technology that China is using, right, facial recognition technology and AI and, some law enforcement detection software is widely used in the US as well. Just obviously not to the extent that we're seeing in Xinjiang. But maybe you could talk a little bit about how that kind of translates to the US and, whether you see this as a problem Americans should be concerned about. Certainly civil rights groups in the US have raised a lot of questions about the use of this technology. There's been plenty of congressional oversight hearings about this. But, maybe you can kind of walk us through what you see as a comparison there.
Yes. So Xinjiang in China is, I see it as the worst case scenario. I mean, we're using a lot of the same technologies in the States, but what's happening in China is just an example of what happens when there is zero transparency, zero accountability. There's a one-party government that is, deploying these technologies on a whim, just arbitrarily, however it wants to engage in predictive policing and pre-crime. It creates this nightmare bureaucracy, this like police state bureaucracy where, everyone has to navigate whether or not they're going to be taken to account because, they might commit some kind of crime in the future. That's the ultimate authoritarian dream, I would say. So in America, we are deploying many of the same technologies. Our police forces and military have been for many years now. I mean, this is nothing new, but it was really the George Floyd protests last summer that ignited or at least blew up the debate further, into whether, the police are properly using these technologies, whether we need more transparency. We need to be able to open the hood and understand what they're doing. I mean, there have been so many studies, and I'm sure you've covered this, Mike, but all these studies that show that, middle-aged white men are the most likely to be correctly identified by facial recognition software. Black, African American, and minority people of color, and women, and elderly people, and children are far more likely to be misidentified or to be mistargeted in some way. There are all kinds of stories. So Reason Magazine, they run this really, it's kind of a sad but also kind of really interesting police blotter where they look at episodes of police abuse that I enjoy reading it because they have a lot of examples of the abuse of these technologies, and they'll tell stories about people who were targeted under a predictive policing system, and the police showed up and they couldn't arrest them, but they just harassed them to no end and like look for is their grass is growing too high. So that's a regulatory fine. They'll just harass them with stuff like that just to wear them down, thinking that they're a criminal threat of some kind. This does happen in America. Like, this is not alien, to like what happens in China. Some of it does happen here, and it's not like alien to our democracy. So the big questions are, what is the solution? And the big questions are that, first of all, we don't really know how the authorities gather their data. There's a blanket of secrecy around it. Even under Freedom of Information Act requests, it's often hard to get a law enforcement authority to sign off and to release that data, because they might argue, well, the criminals are looking at it too. The criminals are looking for ways to evade our system, so we're not going to tell you about it. Also, there's the issue of, like, is the software actually any good? And one of the fundamental issues in American the legal system is that the software, these are often trade secrets, and they are proprietary information, industry information, kept by a company that's extremely valuable to them. So it's very difficult to open the hood and look at the code, look at the algorithm. How is that algorithm being trained, and what kind of data is being used to train it? We often just don't know, and that leads to the question of, well, how do we know that this is any good? There was one piece of software that was called Predpol, that around the time of the George Floyd protests last year um, had it claimed to be able to kind of like target neighborhoods based on AI that were more likely to have property related crimes. But a number of police departments just dropped it, claiming that it didn't really help them. It just wasn't that useful. So, there are a lot of questions. I think that fundamentally in America, this is a transparency problem. I think that if we open the books more and open the systems, find a way to open it without damaging a private company's bottom lines, then I think that will solve a huge number of challenges that we face with this technology. But I'm not totally optimistic that we're headed in that direction. I think that government transparency has been, overwhelmingly for decades now, moving backwards. I mean, I think that the government has become extremely more secretive about what it does. But we need, I think that the key is, passing more legislation and legal tools that will allow, journalists, civil society, just regular citizens to be able to, just force the government to tell people what it's doing.
Yeah, sadly, I agree with you that I think we're gone backwards there, and certainly can relate to the many, many FOIA denials for all of the reasons that you stated there. From the Q&A here, do you have any research or have you learned of China sharing any of the surveillance technologies with other countries, particularly developing nations?
Yes, and I go into that in a huge section in the book too. Yes, China and Chinese companies in particular have been selling and sharing these technologies with countries all over the world. So, in America, we passed a number of sanctions. The European Union has sanctioned Chinese companies too. So it's a little more difficult for this to arrive here. But there have been a number of studies done by think tanks in DC that show that the countries that tend to adopt these systems tend to be middle income countries, so they're not rich, they're not poor. So countries such as Kenya in East Africa, another one would be I think Colombia. Like these are countries that they're not totally suffering, but their governments see the need to have like safe city systems. They have a problem often of urban crime, and they want to crack down on crime, or maybe ease all the terrible traffic that exists in a city like Nairobi, which is just a bustling metropolis. But that's not the whole story. So some of these regimes are somewhat democratic. They're reasonably liberal, and it's I don't know. I mean, I can't get inside those governments and see exactly what they're doing, but I would imagine that they have some kind of restraint on what can be done with this tech. But the real problems come into play when we get into countries, authoritarian regimes. So Uzbekistan is one example that I documented. It had adopted Chinese technology, and it had used this extremely authoritarian, like Orwellian, bizarre language. They said that they were going to use Chinese tech to, quote, digitally manage political affairs, quote unquote. So what does that mean? It sounds like they're just repressing and surveilling people, and Uzbekistan has a history of doing this. There are a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa South America, Eastern Europe that have enthusiastically adopted technologies from Huawei, major Chinese company, that that have outright just said that, yeah, we're going to surveil the opposition party, we're going to hack into their computers. And I think it was in Uganda that it turned out that the ruling authorities there had used Chinese technologies to like hack and surveil opposition party figures. So this is well documented. So so like I said before, Xinjiang is the worst case scenario, but my concern after writing this book is that we might be just simply entering two extreme spheres, that are divided among the world. Like, I just wonder in the future, if you're a tourist in America and let's say you're traveling to Uganda, or you're traveling to Uzbekistan for some kind of fun trip, are you just going to enter this veil of total surveillance on your entire trip where you're just being watched until the time you leave, and then you go back to the States and you're still being watched, but there are some restrictions on what we can do here? Like, are we going to enter this world where there's two, there's like an iron curtain of technology being deployed, and then there's like a more democratic world where it's not deployed as much and we're relatively free? Like, I think that that's what the 21st century is going to kind of look like in terms of geopolitics.
Yeah, maybe we can pivot a little and talk about some of the social platforms. So Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, right, are generally banned in China and prevent, the Chinese government prevents citizens from getting news that would normally challenge the government. So what are Chinese news consumers told about what's happening in Xinjiang, and how does the Chinese government narrative kind of square with the reporting that you've done?
Yeah, so one of the things, I'm sure some people in the audience have been to China before. One of the things that's so fascinating and also unsettling about reporting on China is that the intensity of state propaganda means that it's a place where it's almost as if real information doesn't exist. And this is a feeling that I think a lot of reporters get when they go to, say Russia and North Korea. It's like you just enter this bubble where you've entered an alternate reality, where there's a different set of narratives drawn from a different set of facts. And regular people often know the true story. They hear rumors, they know what's going on, but they're often not going to talk to you about that. That's just suicide for them. So you go, like, if you go to China and let's say you use a search engine like Baidu, which is the Google equivalent, you could search for foreign news, but it's pretty much all going to be censored. You can try to get on Twitter, it's going to be blocked. You can try to get on Facebook, it's going to be blocked too. Gmail, very difficult to access unless you have a VPN. And it really does create this interesting, psychological effect where it's as if, whenever I spend a lot of time in China, it's like I step in and then I step out, and I'm almost thinking, what just happened? It's like you step out and suddenly you're just overloaded with, like Twitter and, social media. Whereas inside China, there's this emptiness. And as a reporter, you're wondering, well, where did all that information go? It's like this void of facts. Um, so the average person in China, just to clarify, I mean, China is a country of 1.2 billion people, and there's never going to be a total agreement among everyone there. But your typical person who maybe lives in Beijing, who's kind of from a middle class family, will usually agree with what the government's doing. I've found they'll usually they'll usually have an understanding that the Uyghurs are a terrorist threat, or that they're a threat to the Chinese nation, and they need to be surveilled, and they need to be, it's for their sake. They need to be brought into the realm of the country, and the region needs to be more developed. China should build infrastructure and inject cash and hand welfare and jobs and all this, and try to elevate the Uyghur people to, as they would see equals to the Han Chinese people who dominate the country. And I could tell you there in America, like I know another country, America, where there are similar kind of narratives and storylines that people tell themselves about minorities and crime here. But in China, like I've tried. I mean, I have talked to people in China who like are willing to open up to some extent about what they feel. And I have met a few who are deeply critical of what the Chinese government is doing. I mean, they know that this is heinous, that this is an atrocity. They never want to be quoted. They never want to be put out there, even anonymously. So there is discontent. The last thing I would say to that is that there is more evidence recently that's been coming out of discontent within the government and within the party there, because there have been a number of massive leaks from China and from Xinjiang to major newspapers in America, to the New York Times, I think BuzzFeed, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the ICIJ. They have received just massive amounts of internal party documents detailing that some officials have gone against the party orders, that they've released people from the camps against what the party wanted to try to save them. They've been punished and disciplined. But just the fact that these leaks are happening show that there is some kind of discontent over what's happening there.
And how does what's happening there kind of compare to other authoritarian nations, right? Particularly North Korea, I think, is the one that comes front of mind for a lot of people. So do you see similar techniques that are used in some of these? Obviously, North Korea has, work camps in Siberia and elsewhere. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So one of the things about North Korea is that when you step into North Korea, you feel like you've entered the past. I mean, I really feel like I've gone back to it's the year 1953, and it's the height of the Cold War. Stalin has had his famine, and they're saying we will bury you, and all the goose stepping soldiers and the missiles in formation. The gulags, like North Korea, is really the continued incarnation in so many ways of just the Cold War, the Iron Curtain mentality. It has that feeling. So North Korea is stepping into the past, but when you step into Xinjiang, I at least felt like I was stepping into the future. I felt like as if I was stepping into the year, say it's 2050, and governments around the world have innovated new forms of surveillance. They're learning, how to control people and how to psychologically, manipulate them to fulfilling their duty. I feel as if I've entered a world where governments have, even authoritarian governments have moved beyond like the old school, the 20th century genocides, the mass atrocities. There's no more, there's no more Holocaust. There's no more Pol Pot. No more Rwanda. It feels as if the government has moved beyond that. And, in this world of smartphones, when anyone can record and leak and show what's happening, they've found ways to just slowly and very subtly just erase a population that they don't like. And that would include both the psychological tactics and the erasure of culture and heritage, but also the use of forced sterilization. So in Xinjiang, many women have been forcefully sterilized. The government says that they're trying to keep birth rates down, but no one actually believes that. The real reason is because they're trying to erase the Uyghur ethnic group and just make them so small that they're just insignificant. So the use of forced sterilization actually, under international law, that would be one of the pillars of what would be considered a genocide. The U.S. State Department under both Trump and Biden have declared Xinjiang, the situation there against the Uyghurs, a genocide. And a number of independent legal experts who work on human rights law have also written lengthy reports full of evidence that say, yes, this is a genocide. I personally agree that it is a genocide. There are some people who say that it's not quite a genocide because of it's more of a cultural genocide because of the slow burn element. It's not the massacres and the gas chambers. But I think that, if you're, say, a journalist reporting on this, I think that as reporters, we can safely use the word genocide by now and consider it to be an accurate depiction.
As we close in on time here, let me just kind of ask you a final question here. Kind of been sticking with me a little bit. So your book traces back the roots of China's extreme surveillance and repression of the Uyghurs to 9/11. So can you talk a little bit about how the war on terror in the U.S. Gave rise to that Chinese dystopia that you write about?
Yeah, so the U.S. did play a role. I mean, it wasn't I wouldn't call it a central role, but it certainly certainly helped China achieve. It helped China achieve its aims that it already wanted to achieve by supplying the propaganda that China needed to convince its people that there was a terrorist threat. So So at Guantanamo Bay, there were 22 Uyghur men who were picked up by U.S. forces or captured in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Some of them had admitted to receiving arms training, but the interrogators determined very quickly after they were captured that they were not jihadists, they were not terrorists. They were typically people who were passing through, who had maybe received some distant to the Taliban, who maybe received some kind of arms training, either for their protection or because in the future they wanted to fight China in some way. But it just wasn't enough to determine that they were actual jihadist terrorists. They were not Taliban fighters in any way. Um, but the problem, so first of all, China was the only country that U.S. authorities allowed their intelligence officials to come into Guantanamo, photograph the men, interrogate them, ask them all these questions. Some of them claim that they were held in chokeholds by U.S. soldiers as they were interrogated at one point. I mean, it was really a mess, and I think it was a terrible decision on the part of the Bush administration to allow those Chinese officials in there, because that puts their families in danger, and they're not even. I mean, these people were not even charged with a crime. They were given the label enemy combatants, which was an invented label by the Pentagon. It holds no, it held no legal standing in the court. And as a result of them not having like a legal, an actual legal label under the law of war, such as whatever it is under the Geneva Conventions, these Uyghur men were just kept. They got trapped in this Kafka-esque like Guantanamo war on terror bureaucracy, where they were found innocent by the interrogators, but they couldn't get out. They were just kept there on and on and on because the government could not figure out what to do with them, because they could not appeal to the courts that easily. They could not say like, I'm innocent. It was just, we have to figure out how to, we know that we have to let these guys out, but there's no process for actually doing that. In the end, the U.S. government paid a number of small governments. So Palau was the big one. It was something like $95,000 per person to accept them as refugees. A lot of them, they were just, they went to Palau, they left Palau pretty quickly and moved to Turkey, which is a popular Uyghur refugee destination. And so, it really was a tragedy of errors, a tragedy of bureaucracy, in which the military and the Pentagon had just, bungled this, just from stage 1 to stage 10, had just bungled this Uyghur situation and just allowed China to jump on it and to use it to build the surveillance state.
This was a fantastic talk. Geoff Cain, we really appreciate you taking the time today to chat with us. I'd also like to thank Elizabeth and the International Correspondents Committee for organizing this event, and to our amazing club membership director, Kate Helster. I cannot more highly recommend everyone check out Geoff's book, The Perfect Police State, which is out now. Geoff, thank you again so much for taking the time here to chat with us, and I'm very excited to hopefully have you back at the Press Club in person soon.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks everybody for joining us.